Well, welcome, friends. You'll notice I titled the meeting the first Sappher open source community call. Um, so, welcome to the inauguration. We haven't yet open sourced Sappher, but we are headed that way, and think maybe this will be kind of something we might do a bit more in the future. So I wanted to I've been working on some things last week and decided I could use some expert opinion about what I was thinking and where we were going with it. So I'm going to show some slides I've been working on for a week. And we'll get a sense from you guys as to what you think of the slides. And what I've been doing recently, the last few years, is to create a deck that kind of summarizes my work for maybe a quarter, sometimes a half year. So if you go through the last number of years, these are the kinds of POCs that I've been doing. So first one was deconstructing Sappher into its base components and thinking about how to put them back together. Another one was looking at Spark as a potential technology and other cloud technologies. I did a little demo system that I've released a video about. I did some data modeling work that we'll go into more detail on today. Did some work on Spark on Z. And then common key buffering using Scala and shared ledger cloud infrastructure a year ago. Last summer, I put together a Sappher open source proposal, and then this last beginning in October, began working with Rakesh directly again, working at Svam Infoware and the new platform he's built. So this is kind of building on top of those efforts that I thought might be next. Here's kind of what I was proposing for the next phase of work. I'm open to your feedback on this, and then where we go further from here is I want to dive more about the data model piece and shared ledger concepts. Okay. So what I thought I'd kind of focus on this next quarter would be make advances in a universal ledger data model. Rakesh and I have done some work on this, but it's progressing a bit more, things that expand outside of financial services to a little bit more generalized ERP system without having to go perhaps all the way to transaction capture. So it's still more on the reporting side of it and the general ledger side, but seeing, can we make this more applicable and more appropriate for broader set of business processes? And when I talk about the data modeling, I'm not talking about just the arbitrary distinction between logical and physical. I want to be able to go all the way down to make something that will scale, like we typically try to do with Sappher, is to think about scale within the initial design of the architecture. I want to advance also some of the ideas on a shared ledger concept, which is actually scale as opposed to blockchain. We want something that could, accommodate the kind of scale we have in existing financial processes in the world, not so expensively as blockchain requires. So this would adding involved parties, generating offsets and private transactions, and determining interaction with private partitions.
Well, that one I'd be interested in hearing more about at some point, because to me it seems to run counterintuitively. Right? A shared ledger concept to kind of a general ledger concept.
Good. We'll go through that today. You'll get a sense of that. Okay. Review most of the most current REA theory advancements around the data model, and there's even things that deal with the shared ledger. Dr. Bill McCarthy sent me a monograph. He sent me a question about chart of account volume types, and I answered it on my blog. he appreciated my answer, and I sent him back a couple of questions on things I was working on. He sent me a copy of his forthcoming monograph that's being published by the American Academic Association. I think it is AAA. And so this will be published, I think, in June. And I've been reviewing this and found quite a bit of interest in here that you'll see as I go through these slides. He also sent me the ISO standards, which were developed in 2015 based upon REA. It was more around EDI kind of implementation, but there's a lot of good stuff in here that has terms and definitions and quite a bit that builds on the REA theory. So I'll give you more of that today as well. Okay. Where I'm going a little bit more directly with Sapphire is I'm building some training modules around Sapphire, and I want to get now into common key buffering more directly. So part of this is trying to get videos built for that work and building sample data that's useful in those video examples, making the sample data useful for more than just the videos, trying to test out some of these concepts as well. Okay. Lastly, and this might be a little bit of a stretch, but I registered a domain name last week called sharealedger.com. And so thinking about, as part of my open source work, I also registered sharealedger.org for an open source approach too. I'm thinking about Rakesh's platform. What from Rakesh's platform would you want on a free sharealedger.com site? What would paid premium services be that would support, customers that services that are provided in that environment, and perhaps consider testing with Rakesh's team a private cloud installation process, which was kind of one place that we thought about going next for my work with Rakesh's team. Okay, let me pause there. Comments, questions, and maybe nothing more. I've got a lot to still show you, you'll see. Excellent. Well, let's go into the data model work, okay? When I got in 2017, I was given this book by Steve Turner, a Bay Area CPA consultant who was interested in the REA theory. I wasn't familiar with it. It was published in 2006. It was built upon the REA concepts. And based upon that, I went back to a number of academic books that I had around REA and reviewed those as well. And then, like I showed you just a moment ago, Bill McCarthy just sent me these two things that I've reviewed. And so you'll see here quite a bit of that influences my thinking today. The inputs from my POC work that affect the data model, we have the FTP system that we've all been involved in building. We also, my third quarter Scala demo, it influenced my thinking on it a little bit. I have some academic work, and then Rakesh's system, Svam's Infoware, also added more concreteness to it. And so those are all elements of this. So let's go into the REA theory. I don't know if you guys have ever gone through this in much detail. I think you'll find it interesting. This diagram is something that has been used for few decades to describe REA. And it's pretty simple in that you have economic events. You could think of those as transactions. There's a resource that's usually used in an economic event, and there's two people associated with each economic event. There's a from and a to. There's also a connection between economic event where you have a duality. So for example, for a purchase of raw materials, you'll have a buyer and a vendor, but the duality will be there's also going to be a cash disbursement of cash, the other resource, from the cashier to the vendor. Okay? Does that make sense? simple.
Yeah, Kip, just a comment here.
I got more questions, but yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So Kip, just comment based on some of the kind of payment systems that I've kind of started to see is I think there are kind of a few more steps, but the mirror part is absolutely true. But some of the intermediate things are in terms of the purchase. The purchase goes through an order,
Yep.
receipt, delivery, return, payment, bill or invoice, then a payment advice, then a payment disbursement, and then the payment application. So there are kind of more steps in between, but that at a high level, that is correct.
To your point, Rakesh, though, so each one of those steps you just talked about, each one of those would be an economic event. So at the most granular level, for each one of those economic events, you should be able to define who the parties are, what the resource is, and what the event is. So for a purchase order or for a return, this model should be able to be applied for any one of those events that you've talked about.
Yeah, and so let's say there's an economic event. So what does a bottom picture represent in an economic event? That every economic event has a purchase and a cash disbursement to it, or what?
No. These are examples of economic events.
Oh,
And for each economic event, there's a duality between them, right? So for a return, let's just do this real quick. On return, it will be an item that's been sold will be the resource, right? And it will go from the customer to the company, back to the company again. With that, there should be a cash refund. So cash is going to be so every one of these, even in banking, right?
What about when a bill comes in? So let's say it's not a purchase, it's an invoice or a bill.
You should be able to model that using this generalized model to model anything that you want to report on, control, manage, forecast in a business.
Okay, so I'm okay with it. I think I'm getting confused with the bottom picture, but I mean obviously we have been dealing with all of that. The duality of it is what I'm kind of struggling with. But anyway, let's go.
By the way, I too, but I want to put forward what I think Kip is explaining to me, at least that's what I'm interpreting.
Sure.
I think what you're saying is that the purchase above the dotted line is more like the business event, and the cash disbursement is really more of the ledger or accounting event.
No,
No,
they're both economic events. It's just that these economic events are related to each other through that duality line. So the duality line is relating two different economic events to each other.
Oh yeah, I can understand it, but it's not always have to be duality. Meaning, if there is duality, then they will be related back to another economic event. For example, a delivery is related to an order. A cash payment advice is related to a delivery because you can't pay unless you have. I'm sorry. Bill is related to a delivery. You can't be given a bill unless you have delivered your goods, and a payment is then related to a bill. So yes, there are events that are related to each other, but they don't have to necessarily relate to each other in the duality facet.
Well, and so I don't know that I could defend that, but it may be an interesting question that we put to Dr. McCarthy at some point.
Sure. Okay.
So I'll bet he'd say that's not an optional relationship. That would be probably his sense, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay. Sounds good. I think we all kind of understand the. Go ahead, Mike.
The basics. I think the basics make sense, Kip. And yeah, I think we're starting to reach to some maybe examples like collateral and insurance and other things that are on the surface not straight up duality. But I mean I think it's worth keep going. Then let's let that sink in a little bit for us.
This is good. Okay, so let me go further though. When we look at the FTP model, right? Initially, you could look at it real quickly and you could say, hey, we kind of had three major entities in the FTP model. We had the standard journal entry, we had the arrangement, we had the involved party, and then we had a balance, which was more of a physicalization of things as opposed to actual logical model, right? So you take those three major entities and the event kind of correlates to the standard journal entry. The agent is an involved party, right? And maybe the resource was an arrangement. Okay, so that's kind of a quick sense of things. Now, if I go further, let's go further. In the most recent monograph that I just showed you, Dr. McCarthy notes, and his co-authors note that they've enhanced that simple model with a more complex version. And what they've added here is they've added time, where the simple model we looked at the previous slide is this bottom layer, which is the accountability infrastructure, what has occurred. Okay? They've added a scheduling layer, and this would be, I think this work is more than 15 years old. This is probably more than 20 years old, because in that book I was given in 2017, it included this sort of diagram or this sort of thinking. The scheduling layer is things to happen, what is scheduled or what will happen. And then the policy layer is what could be or what should be. Okay. So when I look at these quickly, right, these yellow entities are type entities. And when I think of them in a physical sense, they're probably standard reference files. They're not high volume, high cardinality entities. So they're mostly just reference files. So I'm not going to focus on those too much because physical implementation and scale on those is not really a big challenge. And since we've already talked about the green ones, then the question comes more around these two new red entities. And we'll go into more detail about thinking about that, okay?
So that's IFRS 9 right there.
Pardon me?
That's IFRS 9, what is expected.
Yes. Okay, so let's look at an example for a moment of how this could be used. Go ahead.
Can you go to full screen?
Yeah, I can. If we look at the, if I just take that, maybe this, I should have put this slide before the other slide there, but if I take this new model as columns, right? And I show you how you use this, you could use this tool in defining a business process and the importance of perspective here, right? If we did something like a ticket airline, an airline ticket, pardon me, the business event would be cash receipt for somebody buying a ticket. They're going to have to pay for that ticket in some way, right? And they're going to get a commitment of a seat. They're going to get assigned, they're going to own a seat at the end of the process. So commitment of a seat. The resource is cash and seats. The contract is the ticket contract. So it's the same contract for both events. The agent one, the in-person, gets the cash, and the agent two, the out person, is the customer, and the commitment is that I'll make payment. For the seat itself, the in is the customer, the out is the ticket agent who gives them the seat, and the commitment they get is, I called it ticket, maybe it's seat, right? Okay. If we go to like a bank deposit, right, cash receipt. So if we have a deposit here, one of the events is going to be a cash receipt, which is going to have the resource of cash. The contract will be in a checking account. The teller receives the money. The customer gives them the money. The commitment is the legitimacy of the payment. That the cash or whatever they've given, whatever they deposited, is legitimate money. Perhaps in the duality, the other side of cash receipt is an increase in checking account balance. The checking account is the resource, or the account balance may be a better name there, right? Contract is the checking account, contract the same one. Customer receives that, the teller gives them that, and the commitment is the availability of funds, or perhaps the interest rate to be paid on that checking account, so on and so forth. Okay. You kind of get a sense of, from this, how to take that sort of thing and apply it to other areas. The one thing that I wanted to point out, though, is that it's important to do this independent of the perspective reporting needs, because as I was doing this just last week, when I got to these last two rows, I was trying to think of what the business event was, and I started with increase asset for one and increase liability for the other. And what that does, though, is that perspective is dependent upon, it doesn't work as the customer's perspective and the bank perspective. This diagram is intended to be able to be agreed to by both parties, whereas that would be dependent upon whether I'm the customer or whether I'm the bank. So imposing a perspective, it would confuse a shared ledger, whereas this sort of model would help progress a shared ledger definition.
Okay. To be honest, I'm still kind of wobbling around these concepts. I think the first thing we all have to do is kind of use the same words to understand the same meaning across. The vocabulary has to be clear across all of us. So I'm still kind of, do transactions always come alone, or do transactions come in pair? That's the first question. Transactions in my mind are always single. You always do one transaction, but as part of that transaction, you exchange resources. That's correct. So the resource, you have party and counterparty in that transaction, and the resource, one type of resource is going from one party to the counterparty, and another type of resource is going from counterparty to party, and that's the completion of the transaction. So I'm not proposing a hypothesis. What I'm saying is we all first need to get to the same vocabulary and definition in order to kind of move the shared, because the sharing of resources, the sharing of transactions, the sharing of accounting all has to be where the meanings are very clear to everybody.
Yep. No, I agree, Rakesh. And to think, this is my first time going through this and explaining this at this level of detail, right? And I'm in giving you a lot of information early on. We're trying to cover a very broad topic, so not being able to be clear about it. This is an introductory thing. A little bit of confusion means you're struggling with the concept, which probably you need to. I will make one comment that might help you a little bit there, right? Is that in a certain sense, the duality, these transactions, this is a single transaction, you're right, but there's a little bit of the debit credit that goes on here in the duality. That's
the resources. Yeah, the resources are moving debited from one end and credited to the other end, whereas the reverse resources or exchange resources are supposed to come from the debited in one and the credited in the other, but they are not part of the same transaction.
No, they can be different, right? The agents can be different for the counterparty, for the other side of it, just like you can do in a debit credit representation.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily, to your point, just because in this case, ticket agent is here and teller is here and customer is here and customer is there, that's not always the case. This is the case I set up had it that sort of mirror images, but that may not always be the case, and the model doesn't require that, right?
Right.
Okay.
I'm sorry, can I ask a maybe more fundamental?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question is, I've been listening, and maybe I'm asking too prematurely. I should probably just continue to listen. But I'll pose the question, and maybe I come back and try to answer it later. Why spend time on an REA meta model? right? In other words, why do we spend time here? It must lead to a better data model in the end.
Yeah, I think that's good, Greg. That's a good question, and I think given the amount of academic research that's gone on in this space, and the REA meta model is a good way of defining it, right? I think we can tap into a lot of thought has gone on into this problem space. And so I think it could be helpful for us in defining or in figuring out tools that might be helpful for us in defining our work and using going forward, and in improving the data model that we ultimately come up with. So it's another body of knowledge to compare against FTP.
I got you.
And see what we detect here that's a little bit different. Right? FTP
yeah.
We have FTP experience on all of us have experience now with 2 large financial services firms over 20 years now, but financial services is only one type of. So is there something we could garner from REA, which has been outside of financial services, that might help us generalize our models more effectively?
And by the way, I think the good problem space for that would be the cash flow world, right? Because that's what we don't, as accountants, really.
Yeah.
Well, CP, we don't really have a cash model, right? We have an accounting model.
And one of the things that's good, you see cash being represented here. Another one that we don't really deal with is inventory in financial services.
Right? Open item accounting is that the thing that we almost got into, but we never did.
Yep. Okay. So let me take you forward then. Okay. So the initial thought was that arrangement was resource, transaction was or volume was event, and an involved party was agent. But you look at it, the new model, you look at it in more detail and you say, wait a minute, arrangement wasn't really a resource. Arrangement was really contract. Okay. So that would be kind of an adjustment that we would have to think about there, is that we haven't really in FTP modeled resource directly.
Yeah, I mean, economic resource is a resource item. Typically in the IBM data model, the resource item is what an economic resource is.
Yes. And that's what, and as I noted here, in financial services, we haven't really dealt with that in a tremendous way. Perhaps facility might be one. And maybe some places you kind of do that, but it's not something we've done very direct.
Yeah, because in FTP we never worried about the quantities. Everything was translated by the product system into an amount.
Yes.
It was never about what exactly the SKUs, the stock keeping unit number is, how many of those are, what the unit price is. All of those were not of interest, at least in FTP, and therefore we didn't focus on our resource item.
Yep, that's right. Okay, so the one other concept we're going to focus, though, as we go forward is, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to make it a purely logical discussion. And so we have found, for scale reasons, these orange entities were common key buffer entities. So how do we consider, and that's really what the key of this is, right? I'm not really concerned with modeling the type, because those are standard indexed access approaches to those typically lower volume tables. But how does this fit into a common key buffering sort of to get to scale? Okay. Okay, so here's my proposal for your consideration. Combined, we might have something that looks a little bit more like this. We would have, and the key to this is that oranges can be accessed, the flat orange or the field orange can be accessed as common key buffering entities. The taupe are more direct or indirect access, non-common key buffering. Okay. So what I've done here is I've renamed arrangement to contract. I've added commitment, and I don't know exactly what reciprocal means on commitment. If we looked at this chart, there's something in here that is, there's a reciprocal line that would be like duality. I'm not quite sure what reciprocal means. So that would require some more investigation. It could be just a recursive call on commitments.
When you say commitment, do you mean facility?
Well, no, I'm talking more in a purchase in an inventory world. I think a good commitment might be a purchase order. Is a commitment because it's future oriented. We want to purchase these things from you. And you can have multiple shipments underneath, multiple events for shipments underneath a commitment. Okay.
That does sound like a facility then, because right,
Could be. Yes, it could be facility in financial services. It could be facility.
like a revolving line of credit. You might be allowed to take 4 draws. Right. You establish a facility between you and the customer that you're allowed to do whatever. Here are your limitations.
Although the facility, if you think of resource as something that exists independent of the customer, the facility might be the resource, and the commitment is how much of that facility is available to this customer. If it's a shared participation.
I mean, the cash or the money is the resource. Facility is access to those resources. Similarly, commitment, if it was a kind of a good, we're talking about goods or services, then commitment might be a right word for goods and services, but facility is the word for cash or money. They're both commitments, sort of commitments for the parties to access resources.
Okay, so I don't know that I can give you a lot more sense about that. More my commitment. I can't defend this entity. This is a hypothesis based upon this model. I'm looking for is this the right thing to do?
Yeah. And okay, so can I talk about the an alternative hypothesis as a discussion point? Obviously, REA has a lot of thought built into it, and the reason I'm doing a alternative is because we want to go back to why we are kind of doing all this. As I understand, and Kip, correct me if I'm wrong, when we think about accounting as a hearts and lungs of organization where we can understand the final the system of record for what my books and records are. In that system, we have very clear understanding of our positions, our numbers.
Yep.
But what we don't have is the counterparty details, counterparty books and records. The idea is that if we are doing the accounting for our pieces and we are kind of 100% sure about the correctness and accuracy of that, we should be by inference correct about portions of our counterparty as well. So for example, if we are kind of trading with Walmart, in making sure my books and records are accurate, whatever portion I'm dealing with Walmart, I should be by inference correct about that portion of Walmart's books and record as well, right?
Let me go a little bit faster here instead of spending so long on slides and give you a bit of overview because I think you're going to a couple slides down the road. So I'm going to skip going much more detailed on this, just to say I think that this might be a second common key buffering group. I'm going to skip this slide a little bit. All I've done here is I've added in those new entities to the previous chart, right, for what that's worth. Monograph, I was surprised to see chapter 5, it starts to go to shared business systems ideas, talking about blockchain, talking about this sort of graph where you have a public process and public data and private data, right? Okay, the two changes they made briefly, Rakesh, to the old graph that we've been dealing with so far is they converted from inside, outside, from and to party and counterparty, to participant, from promise to promise. So this little change is the only change they had to make to start to think about a shared ontology for both parties. Okay. So when I went to thinking about that, Rakesh, I said, listen, okay, so you had a shared everything environment between two counterparties, Tom and Jay. That's what this would look like. You have a shared nothing environment, which is what our existing counterparty businesses look like. You know, I have my books, you have your books, and we reconcile the two. If I'm trying to get to a shared environment, I have some that is private for Tom, some that is private for Jay, and I have some that are shared. And the way of thinking about the shared, as you were going to, Rakesh, is that it could be that the same business event here is represented, is thought about from Jay's perspective as a debit, but that same business event is thought about from Tom's side as a credit. And the opposite could be true as well. So when I went to that sort of, go ahead.
No. Okay, finish your thought.
When I went to that sort of model, I said, listen, it may be possible that we have this shared environment could still be modeled in this world with the event here that is shared between them, but the perspective is not embedded in this system. The perspective is interpreted over here of what that looks like. And you simply add a participant ID to allow you to group together into who are the participants in that shared ledger. I'll give you a couple more slides, then we'll go back where you want to go. You'll get a sense of all of my thinking so far. I started to outline and said, listen, to create a shared ledger, you might do the process where Tom creates the ledger, Tom authorizes Jay to be a partner, they agree on shared rules. So this is the shared COA representation. Tom's title for that is going to be this, whereas Jay's title for those codes is this. Then each of them create their own reference data in their own environments. And Tom has to interpret A, giving it his account number, his title, and this is shared. Whereas Jay interprets A to be a different account number because they don't want to share the chart of account completely between the two of them. They will wait to have their own chart. So this chart is shared, but this is unique to Tom's. This will be Tom's reporting chart. One more slide. In this instance, then you also have to have some other pieces to represent Tom's additional debit and credit, his additional reference data for his other chart of account elements. In this instance, maybe Jay's is a fully formed entry in the shared partition because it has no P&L impact. So Jay, for this particular entry, doesn't have to have any additional reference data. I could go further. There's a couple more slides here, but we're getting kind of to the end of the thought process.
Right. So, I think a couple of questions that we all kind of have to be clear in our heads is, and I'm still struggling with. I think we are starting with a couple of hypotheses that we need to make sure that it's true. We started with the hypothesis that we need a shared ledger. The question is, what would be the benefit for the end customers if we had a shared ledger?
What's the scope shared, by the way? Is it in a large organization or is it across the organization?
Across organizations. Right now we're talking about, because ledgers are shared within an organization for sure.
They are. What we've done internally for our FTP client is we've shared the ledger between departments, which has reduced the data volumes involved because you don't have multiple data supply chains.
Listen, in AFTP, if you think of entity, right, as a multi, the thing that makes it multi-tenant, right? Then yes, we have a shared kind of ledger, and we have one accounting schematic and so forth. Then we got another implementation, by the way, in another country, which is sharing the same accounting schematic, but a completely different physical implementation of a ledger. There's no sharing, right, in between the two. Now we create journalized entries for internal unit kind of stuff and all that, whatever. Right now we could benefit from HSPC to have one internal ledger that's multi-tenanted, truly multi-tenanted, right? We have all the countries in one ledger. But when I go outside of the organization, I think about the whole ecosystem of suppliers and customers. I don't know where you stop.
Well, so the question is, so the point, I think, Greg, is you stop when there's going to have to be, we have to accommodate all of that variability. There will be some customers that you do trading with so infrequently that it doesn't make sense to share a ledger because the setup of it would be so expensive. So you use the same model that you use today, and you have a partition that is the trades with that customer. But for every customer, for highly integrated customers, like we went to with integrated, inventory or manufacturing supply chains, the higher the integration you can have with each individual supplier or each individual customer, depending upon the case may be, I think you might be getting to a shared, a reduction in transaction cost of 60%, because you're reducing that number of transactions and bookkeeping processes down to that.
Yeah, I guess, and this might be where I miss something. When it comes to a product administration aspect, I see your point. But when it comes to the back office general ledger system is where I struggle.
Well, the intent, though, is for the general ledger system, I'm doing an aggregation of the data in those product systems to get me to my general ledger view.
Because okay, that's fair. So you're basically saying I'm actually kind of doing away with the product administrative.
That's where FTP needs to go next. Is that implementation for each customer of FTP is too expensive because it's too back office oriented. Okay. Only when I start to attack the product systems do I start to get to 40-60% reduction in cost, and that's a self-funding mechanism that allows me to do this work and pay for it.
I gotcha.
Okay, so that's what we want to be kind of 100% clear in terms of shared ledgers. Shared ledgers allows different cost centers, lines of businesses, organizations to share their product system costs.
Yes.
Correct.
And if I can take out if I can reduce the complexity and the cost of the overhead of the general ledger as well, I add to that benefit.
That's just a view at that point.
It's just a view.
Right. So the question is, how practical, feasible would it be, or what is the value case that we think that multiple organizations are going to share their product system? What will be the benefits that they're going to derive from that?
Well, one thing that the benefit that
other than cost, other than just a product cost system, the system cost.
Well, data cost though as well, Rakesh, in terms of reconciliation, statement processing is a reconciliation process.
Right. But it's still a cost of doing business, right?
It's a cost of doing business, but it's not necessarily a system cost, right? It's an accuracy business data cost.
Yeah. So when I think of, let me answer that question. I mean, again, I don't know if I'm correct on that, but I suspect that some of the actual goods and services companies that have warehousing, supply chains, manufacturing, and so on and so forth, the timeliness of information in terms of aligning their manufacturing cycles and batches and ordering and just in time of manufacturing might really benefit by or very fast view of the aggregated supply and demand in the pipeline. That might be really useful. Now, if I so it's not just it's not just the system cost, but also the cost of the overall manufacturing supply chain cycles because of less inventory in the pipeline. Now, if I translate that into financial world, a lot of float sits around in different accounts, and when you think of banks and financial institutions, money is the resource, and if the money is sitting in inventories without earning return on it, then that's lost opportunity. And if you think of all of those resources, money resources in financial institutions, where they are, who needs them, and how to get from people who have them to the people who don't have them, and visibility into that across organization might be useful, so that we can cut the middlemen. Middlemen meaning people who take the float. You have to invest that, and you have to make that decision. Sorry.
Oh, because you don't know the reality, right? Meaning, if you understood more scientifically how much money you needed to support, whatever activities, you could maybe, inventory less. Right? How do you inventory less is when you have a good insight in terms of what the customers are going to want overnight. Yeah, and all that.
So I think I think before we kind of get to the model, we probably just have to a good understanding of here's what we're trying to achieve, and that achievement is going to have these benefits, so that when we implement it, because I don't think implementation would be an issue, we can get to the implementation quickly. But soon thereafter, having people to come and explain the benefits, we probably have a good use case to go. We have to probably pick an industry as well, because you can't implement everything. I mean, each implementation is going to require a lot of energy in terms of the industry knowledge and all of those details that we have to master. So having the benefit, having what is actually going to be beneficial for the customers is going to be useful in the beginning, before we say what we are sharing and how we go about sharing it.
Okay, so coming back to your point, Rakesh, my point in this meeting was kind of to give you a sense of what I'm thinking kind of my next focus would be. Mm-hmm. If anyone wants to join me in this work, happy to have.
Absolutely.
Rakesh and I fairly effectively did mostly Monday, mostly Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays, every day at 7:30 a.m. Central for all the fall into January, had a daily call where we were jumping on the call, scrum call, and we would talk about what are we doing next. And so this was kind of, you get a sense of kind of where I was going, since you'll get more of this. The video that Rakesh and I produced from FPEM used the Virginia data. I was thinking of trying to convert the Virginia data into the data model that I've shown, to kind of do common key buffering work, to at least say, what does that look like? And think about that. So it's kind of that sort of work that I was thinking of going on, to get our discussions down to a more practical level, and think, how can I use this effectively?
So we are having discussions. I mean, all the questions that are coming to my mind, I'm gonna just kind of keep them blurting out, because eventually we will get together a good structure and then start working on it. My first question that comes to my mind is, why do we have to share the ledger? Why do we have to share something that has debits and credits? Why can't we just share the events that are resources that are basically? Sorry, go ahead.
I think that's a good question, and that gets to the point, I think, of the REA model, right? That's where REA is trying to go. Is in some sense, even though I used debit credit as a representation of the duality, in a certain sense, the debit credit can can get it more complex than you need for the simplicity of the duality.
Right. Because
It's a valid question.
because there are other challenges as well. Sharing your ledger is sort of raises so many defenses in terms of what are we because a lot of people can get a lot of leading information from, no matter whether it is private or public. Even if you share a little bit, people are those are kind of EPS sensitive items, and people might say, but sharing your resource levels with somebody who's a supplier might have a less threshold as opposed to kind of a ledger. So that was the first question. So something to think about. I don't know what is the right answer.
I can react there again. Right. In the model here, I'm considering sharing the event, but the perspective that's private is not shared. So you're setting up a model whereby the actual ticket is and the seat assignment are shared. Whether that is, on a loan, for example, whether there's a loan loss reserve, the loan loss reserve is going to be in the private structure.
Okay, so good. So the sharing is of the events. The private parts are the conversion of that into debits and credits for the private use, as opposed to sharing of the debits and credits that are created. Okay.
Yep.
For the next meeting, and what should we have prepared before that, so that the meeting is productive?
Good. What I would come forward in the next meeting, based upon your feedback, this has been helpful to me. If we were to meet again on Wednesday, I would try to come with a better bit of a plan around these steps and propose that back to you as to here's actions we might take, and we could be a bit more prescriptive about what we're going to do over the next few weeks in working towards that.
Can I say, for the Wednesday meeting, can we have a vision statement, and once we are kind of finished with this, what would we have in our hands, sort of clearly defined, and we all can agree on that? Would that be good?
Yeah. So you'd like me to draft that? So take
yeah,
feedback here, come back to you with a vision statement, and we process more of what we've talked about here to agree on what that vision statement should be.
Okay,